Alright, so today I want to talk about a very unusual and controversial philosopher from Russia, Alexander Dugin, who is still alive by the way. You might have heard his name in the news sometimes. In Russia, he is often described as a political philosopher and geopolitical thinker, and sometimes people even call him Putin's personal philosopher. Whether he actually has that level of influence or not is debated, but what's clear is that Dugin has spent decades thinking about the big questions. Questions like what kind of civilization should shape the future of this earth? And to answer that question, he developed something he calls fourth political theory. The idea actually begins with a simple observation about the 20th century. According to Alexander Dugin, the last century was dominated by three big political ideologies: liberalism, communism, and fascism. Each of these ideologies had its own central subject. For liberalism, the central subject was the individual. For communism, it was the class. For fascism, the central subject was the state or nation. Now, historically, we know what happened. Fascism was defeated in World War II. Communism collapsed with the fall of the Soviet Union. And that left only one ideology standing: liberalism. After the Cold War, many thinkers in the West believed that liberal democracy basically has won forever. The political scientists like Francis Fukuyama famously called this the end of history, the idea that liberal democracy and global capitalism had proven themselves to be the final form of political organization. But Dugin completely disagree with this. For him, the victory of liberalism is not the end of history, it is the beginning of a deeper crisis. First, he argues that the liberalism has become the ideological foundation of a unipolar world dominated largely by America. But his criticism goes even deeper than geopolitics. He believes that the real problem with liberalism begins at the philosophical level. At the center of liberal ideology is the idea that the individual is the most important thing in society. Politics exists to protect individual freedom. Progress means expanding individual choice. But Dugin argues that once the individual becomes supreme value, the liberalism slowly begins dissolving every other structure that once gave meaning to human life, like religion, tradition, shared identities, and something strange happens after it. When those structures disappear, the individual doesn't necessarily become stronger or freer. Instead, the individual becomes alone and isolated. Modern society begins producing a new kind of human being, the last man of Zarathustra. Identity becomes something built through lifestyle choices, Apple or iPhone, and freedom becomes ability to choose between products. Meaning becomes consumption. As Dugin writes in Fourth Political Theory, I quote, liberalism has liberated the individual from all collective identities, but at the final stage, it begins to liberate the individual from himself. End quote. And this leads him to what? This leads him to one of his most provocative claims. He says, liberalism is the perfection of slavery, not the end of slavery enforced by chains, but a new form of slavery where people believe they are completely free. People feel free because they can choose what to buy, what to watch, what to believe. But the system shaping those choices remains invisible. Markets shape desires. Technology captures attention. Identity itself becomes something that can be bought and sold and fabricated. People are not forced to obey. Now people willingly participate in the system. Freedom becomes something like the freedom to choose your own genes. Dugin also believes liberalism is built on a deeply materialistic view of reality. Everything becomes about economics, productivity, and growth. Religion gets pushed into private life. Meanwhile, something else quietly takes quite meanwhile something else quietly takes over in public life. Capitalism becomes the real public religion. People may hesitate to talk about God in public, but everyone easily talks about markets, investment, economic growth. The language of finance replaces the language of meaning. And here Alexander Dugin draws deeper inspiration from philosophers like Martin Heidegger. Heidegger argued that the modern civilization has forgotten the question of being. Dugin echoes this when he writes, I quote, modernity is characterized by the forgetting of being. End quote. Instead of asking what existence means, modern societies focus almost entirely on managing resources, production, and technology. Everything becomes an object. Everything becomes a resource. Even human beings become human resources inside economic and technological systems. Modern civilization begins valuing time, change over being. Everything must grow, everything must change, everything must accelerate, everything must move faster. But this constant movement through time and change comes at a cost. Civilization expands endlessly across the surface of reality. More production, more consumption, more speed. But this expansion is purely horizontal. There is growth, but there is no ontological depth. Movement, but no meaning. Modernity moves faster and faster, but it no longer knows where it is going. And this is why Dugin proposes what he calls the fourth political theory. Instead of the universal ideology dominating the entire world, he imagines a multipolar world. A world made up of different civilizations: Western, Russian, Indian, Chinese. And according to him, these civilizations are not just different cultures, they are different representation, different ways of understanding reality itself. Different civilization reveal different modes of being. You see, according to him, being shapes time. How time will unfold depends on how we interpret existence itself. You know, how future will shape itself depends on our current interpretation of being. Like, we have this future utopian image of liberal capitalistic future, like flying cars and AI robots doing all our work. This certain type of dream which will manifested in reality one day has its own ontological priorities, partialities, and assumptions. Metaphysical and ontological assumptions and priorities, like materialism, individualism. You see, these hidden assumptions about what we think what reality is, what taught to us what is reality, what is real, what is existence itself. This propaganda, this everything is a propaganda. You see, every ideology promotes itself as something neutral, but it is not. So liberalism teaches us a definition of being, and once we by heart this definition of being, we see the world through particular lenses that are so deep within us, invisible, that we don't even know we are ensnared, we are trapped by this particular limited view of the world. And this interpretation of being decides what future will be manifested. You see, what you cannot think, you cannot become. What you are not taught, you cannot think. So instead of forcing the whole world into a single political model like liberalism, Dugin believes different civilizations should develop according to their own traditions and philosophical foundations. Now, whether one agrees with Alexander Dugin or not, his question forces us to pause and think. What happens to a civilization like liberalism that places the ego at the center of reality but forgets the deeper ground of being? If we borrow language from Indian philosophy, modern liberal civilization seems to elevate ahankara, the ego, over self, over everything else. But traditions like Vedanta reminds us that behind ego there is Atman, the ground of being itself, and maybe that is the deeper question beneath all political debates. Not simply which system should rule the world, but whether our civilization is rooted in the ego or in the being.